All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and supported entirely by listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. So if you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused podcasts and radio shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and go check out the other great shows in our network. And, of course, if you want to support the work that we're doing here at Working People, and we hope that you do, so that we can keep growing and keep bringing you more important conversations, please leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Share these episodes on your social media and with your coworkers and friends and family members. And as always, the best thing that you can do to support the show is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. All you got to do is go to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you will immediately get access to all of the awesome bonus episodes that we've recorded and published over the years for our amazing subscribers. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and, speaking of bonus episodes, you guys know that I've been promising a whole lot of them this month, and I'm excited to say that those are coming down the pike for all of our amazing subscribers. So we've got a great interview that I did with the journalist Indigo Olivier, who went to the Teamsters for a Democratic Union convention in Chicago last month and reported on it for Jacobin. So I got to talk with Indigo about all of that. And, as an added bonus, we are going to be posting both an audio and a video version of that interview for our beloved patrons. Also, by popular demand, we are following up on our fun Halloween bonus episode last year with another all Alvarez sibling panel. So, as you guys know, last year we gave y'all a working class breakdown of the Halloween classic Ernest Scared Stupid. And, this year we're leveling up. And we're taking a deep dive into another spooky favorite and a mainstay in the Alvarez household, the absolute classic movie, Tremors. We watched that movie like a billion times, and we have a lot of thoughts about class and graboids. So if you want to check that out, definitely go subscribe. We've also got a super special Striketober bonus episode with a super special panel of labor badasses. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but I am beyond excited for that panel, and I can't wait to share it with y'all. So, we're making good on our promise to make up for last month's lack of bonus content, and you guys don't want to miss out on that. So definitely head on over to Patreon and subscribe now. Lastly, before we get to today's episode, I wanted to also let you guys know that we're going to be hosting our first ever Working People live stream this Sunday, October 24th, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that is this Sunday, October 27th, and the stream will start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, we're still working out some of the technical details, but we will be streaming this to the Working People YouTube channel. And yes, we do have a YouTube channel. We just never really use it, but we're working on that. And we have linked to that in the show notes for today's episode. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, the full show notes are always on every other platform. For some reason, iTunes just cuts off how much text we can put there, which is very annoying. But anyway, if you go to like Spotify or Google or our website, you can find the full show notes there. Anyway, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook as well if you aren't already. because we're going to be posting updates for y'all about the live stream as we build up to this Sunday. Now, this is something that we didn't initially plan for, or, we would have given y'all a little more heads up, but it's for an important cause, and we wanted to do everything that we could to make it happen as soon as we could. So, some of y'all already know this, but our amazing producer, Jules, and his family have been going through a really rough time, and we want to show them all the love and support we possibly can. I don't want to put too much of their business out in public, but if you want to know more, you can click on the link in the show notes to the GoFundMe that's been set up to assist Jules and his family during this difficult time. Now, if you have it in your hearts and your wallets, please donate what you can to their GoFundMe, and we're going to make it our goal to hit that fundraising goal with this live stream that we're going to be doing on Sunday and that I'll be hosting. And, trust me, it's going to be a lot of fun, right? I mean, the listener live hang session was awesome. This is kind of, going to be a live stream, version of that. We're going to hang out. We're going to talk about Striketober. We'll have some spooky Halloween fun. We'll have some special friends and guests drop by. And, of course, we'll be responding live to your questions and your comments in the live chat. So, yeah, again, please help us support Jules and his family. Share the fundraiser in the show notes. Donate what you can. And mark your calendars so you don't miss our live stream this Sunday, October 24th, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for our man Jules and his family. We love them, and we need to support them. So, yeah, come hang out with us. Help us raise the money that they need. And thank you guys so much for doing that. All right. So we've got a nice, big, meaty episode and an amazing conversation to share with y'all. So let's get to it. Now, as we all know, there is a lot of important history being made right now in this moment, and something potentially game-changing is unfolding among the American workforce. As we speak, 10,000 UAW members at John Deere are on strike in Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas. 35,000 healthcare workers at Kaiser Permanente have authorized a strike. And I believe that number may be closer to 50,000 by the time that you hear this. It's kind of like IATSE, right? There are a number of different locals that are all kind of have sort of different timelines. But anyway, that's a shit ton of healthcare workers at Kaiser Permanente, and that's a really important struggle. On top of that, 1,400 workers at the cereal giant Kellogg's are on strike in Nebraska, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. As we know, 1,100 coal miners in Alabama have been on strike since April. 800 nurses in Massachusetts have been on strike at St. Vincent Hospital since March. And many, many other strikes and strike authorizations are also unfolding as we speak. And on top of that, record numbers of U.S. workers are voluntarily quitting their jobs in what is being called the Great Resignation, right? According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 4.3 million workers voluntarily quit their jobs in August alone, which is the highest number that we've seen since they started tracking those damn stats in the first place, right? I mean, something is happening here. And, we over on this side are going to keep doing our best to make sure that you guys know what's going on. And we're going to do that here on Working People and at The Real News and in these times. If you are a worker and you want to make sure that you have a platform to tell your story and have your struggles covered, definitely reach out to us. And, we're going to talk about a really important struggle for today's episode that's happening right now and that all of us need to be paying attention to. So, I mentioned the UAW earlier. when I mentioned the strike at John Deere. So, that strike is the largest private sector strike since GM workers hit the picket line in 2019. And it's a really important one. It's also very telling, right? At a time when John Deere is scheduled to record record profits of around a staggering $5.7 billion this year, the fact that the union membership was presented with a tentative agreement that was reached by the union leadership and the bosses, and the membership overwhelmingly voted it down. I mean, we're talking like 90% of members voting and 90% of those workers saying hell no to that deal. That's quite a turnout. And that tells you that there is a big disconnect between the leadership and the rank and file. And that's why it's going to be really important to see what happens with a referendum that is taking place right now within the UAW. Now, as the great Jonah Furman writes in Labor Notes, quote, United Auto Workers members will soon vote in an unprecedented referendum to decide whether the union's 400,000 working members and nearly 600,000 retirees will directly elect their top officers. Ballots hit the mail October 19th and are due back November 29th. The UAW's executive officers are currently elected to 4-year terms by delegates at its convention. An administrative caucus has dominated these positions for the past 7 decades, using the powers of appointment available to international officers to wield tight political control. In the auto industry, where most UAW members work, many are frustrated with years of concessionary contracts that have allowed automakers to build a 2-tier workforce, with the number of temporary and lower-paid workers ballooning. For decades, UAW reformers have called for one member, one vote, and it has always been voted down by convention delegates. Unite All Workers for Democracy, or the UAWD, the new caucus behind the resolution push, has spent the past 2 years pushing for one member, one vote. It follows in the footsteps of Teamsters for a Democratic Union, which helped win direct elections in that union in a federal consent decree in the late 1980s. End quote. All right, so that's the background that you need. But, we also go into all of this in more depth with my guest today, Justin Mayhugh, who is a GM worker in Kansas City and an organizer with the UAWD caucus within the UAW. And, I have so many things that I want to say about Justin and how great he is. I could have talked to him for hours, honestly. And, it was just so great getting to know more about him and his backstory, the work that he does at GM, and about all the issues within the union and the rank and file energy that, he and so many others are injecting into the union and into the labor movement writ large. But, this intro has already gone on long enough, and apologies for that, but we had a lot of, announcements to kind of get through. So I'll wrap things up and I'll let my conversation with Justin speak for itself. But I wanted to make sure that y'all had some context about this referendum, because I know for those of us who don't know a whole lot about unions or how they work, this stuff can kind of feel in the weeds. But when you hear someone like Justin talk about it, you realize how important it is and how necessary, right, this struggle is to turning this moment of labor strife into a labor movement with real teeth and real claws. Because here's the thing, like I said before, something is happening right now. The working class is waking up. People have had enough of being taken for granted, exploited, dehumanized, disrespected, treated like replaceable garbage, while the rich just get infinitely richer, and most politicians don't do shit to help anyone but their donors. People have had enough of being on the losing side. And, they've had enough of a shrinking labor movement that always seems to be on its heels. And they're fighting back. Workers are fighting back. Workers like Justin. This is his story.
Hey everybody, my name is Justin Mayhugh, and I'm a member of UAW Local 31 in Kansas City, Kansas. And I'm also a worker at General Motors Fairfax Assembly Plant in Kansas City. And I'm an alternate delegate to the UAW Constitution for my local, as well as the guide on the local executive board. And I'm a member of UAWD, United Workers for Democracy, which is a caucus within the UAW that is organizing for reform of our union.
Hell yeah. Well, Justin, it's so great to get a chance to talk to you, man. Really, really excited to get to know more about you, how you came to do this work and to be kind of so involved in the union and, and also just like everything that's going on right now, right? There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in the labor movement, a lot of necessary stuff going on among unions and organized labor. And we're going to really, dig into that in our conversation today. Really, really want to get your thoughts on things like, the John Deere strike, the, big referendum that the UAW has coming up. So we're gonna dig into all of that. But as you and I were talking about before the recording, right? We always love to get to know more about the folks that we're talking to and to really kind of let people know and to remind ourselves, right, that when we're watching on our social media feeds or on our news channels and we're seeing these important worker struggles, these aren't just like happening to nameless figures in the abstract, right? I mean, every single one of these struggles is about human beings with lives and families and long histories that led them to this point, and that makes it all the more important for workers to win what they deserve. So before I go off on a big philosophical tangent, that's all to say is that, yeah, man, I want to know more about you and kind of how you came to do the work that you do. So I'm going to start off small. Are you originally from Kansas City?
Yeah, I've lived in Kansas City my whole life. And basically, like, if people don't know, Kansas City is actually, it's in Missouri and in Kansas. So I've actually lived in Kansas City, Missouri my entire life. I lived in Nashville about 15 years ago, back when I used to play music, but that was probably for a year or a little over a year. But other than that, I've been here the entire time.
All right. So there's got to be a backstory there. So you did a year in Nashville playing music. What kind of music do you play?
We played pop punk music back during that craze, like the early 2000s when that was like sweeping the nation for a little while. And not surprisingly, our lead singer was kind of a jerk. So we broke up. We were about to get a record deal. It's just that story you've heard a million times, wherever it's like a band with a lot of potential and then they just can't stand each other. We broke up, and then I kind of just, drifted for quite a few years, not really knowing what I wanted to do in life.
Yeah, you're right. It's sad, but definitely a story we've heard one too many times. And I've joked many times on the show, right, about how I'm deeply, jealous of guys like you who are musically talented because I don't have a goddamn musical bone in my body, and that translated in like high school to me being like really jealous of everyone who could play an instrument. But I guess the fortunate side is, I never had that sort of experience. But were you always, I guess, in that sort of like punk-ish scene, or were you kind of like a kid growing up in Kansas City who didn't do what you were told, or was that something that came later on in life?
I think I was always I was kind of a kid that didn't like to do what I was told, but I did. I always had this thing in me where I'm like, it, you know, it rubbed me the wrong way that like, you know, you have to do this, you're supposed to do that. But like, I didn't really resist too much until I got, you know, quite a bit older. But no, I grew up, like when I first got into music, it was that story you've heard a million times before, the Beatles, you know, like all those, you know, the Rolling Stones. I was a big classic rock kid growing up. And then I, you know, started hanging out with these guys in high school, and they were into punk music and pop punk. And I just kind of really got into that, like, pretty big for like a few years. But it was it's funny because it was such a short period of time. I mean, I still enjoy some of that music, but I realize it's probably a lot of it's nostalgia for me that, you know, reminds me of the good old days, you know, whenever you didn't have a bunch of responsibilities and stuff. But, you know, like I'm more of a classic rock. I'm back to listening to the Beatles all the time, and a very divisive band named Oasis. That's like one of my favorite bands of all time, that like either people love them or they hate them. But I'd say the Beatles and Oasis are my two favorite bands of all time.
Oh man. Yeah. You know, you're talking about, kind of that nostalgia that we feel, right. For the times in our lives when we didn't have so many goddamn responsibilities, and life wasn't so busy.
Bills.
No bills. Yeah, you know, it's like
only I mean, I only had girl problems, you know, but at the time, you know, like it just seemed like, I don't know if it's like this for everybody, but it's like, am I ever going to appreciate the moment I'm living in right now? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or it's like, it's not until you get like 10 years later, you're like, you know what, that was actually a pretty good time in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's a really, really kind of important point that I think, like, you put your finger on something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I guess I still don't quite know what to do with that. Right. Because, you know, I have this book of interviews that I did with workers during like the height of the COVID pandemic. So that's like last December and January. And I remember in one of the interviews, I'm talking to this bartender in Portland named Ashley. And we started off talking about this, right? About like, you know, it's not something that like millennials only feel, right? But I was kind of connecting to it through like my older millennial experience. But I was like, man, I feel like, you know, looking back, one of the things that I realize now is that we just really weren't raised to ever feel at home wherever we were, right? It's like no matter where you were or when you were, you always were looking towards the next step, right? Even like from an early age, it's like you're moving from first grade to second grade to third grade, elementary school to junior high to high school to college, or high school to a job, or to, you know, kind of some sort of, you know, technical program, right? And then if you get a job, it's like, all right, now I got to move up the ladder, right? Or I got to go work at this place to get this experience. And it's just like, I don't know, it is kind of sad to kind of, look back at those times and realize how happy you were, how comfortable you were. But like at the time, you never really gave yourself that ability to enjoy it or to feel at home in it. And that even seeps into like, you know, some really kind of deep personal stuff. Like, you know, I don't know if I've shared this story on the podcast before, but I had this really weird experience like not too long ago where, you know, I think like during the COVID-19 pandemic, right, when we were all in lockdown, or a lot of us were in lockdown, or even if we were going out to work, we were trying to really limit how much we went out. Besides that, I think a lot of us kind of started like rifling through the old photo albums and old Facebook photos and stuff like that. And I saw this picture of my brothers playing basketball in front of our old house. And I mean, we played just so many hours and days and weeks of ball outside in the driveway. And so, you know, it was just, I was looking at it. I was remembering kind of how great, you know, that time was playing hoops with my brothers or just shooting around by myself. And I was like, man, yeah, my brothers look good. They look young. They look thin. And I think it was like my mom or my sister McKenna who was like, that's you in the picture. And I squinted and I saw that, yeah, the guy on the left was me. And I got really sad because, you know, I've always had I always grew up husky. I always had this kind of body image problem, not living in a family and living amongst people who were always very cruel about, my weight didn't help. But like, it just made me so sad to look at that picture and think like, man, I was so young and athletic, and I never saw myself that way at that time. I really, really didn't. Right? I don't know. You just kind of got me thinking about that now.
No, and that's man. We could have been. It sounds like we had a very much the same kind of, because when every once in a while I'll see a picture of me when I was 18 years old, and I was like, yeah, like I had, I've always had some of the same kind of body image problems that you're speaking about. But like when I was playing music, I was basically like starving myself, like, because I've always had the same problem what you're saying. Like I've always just been naturally like a bigger kind of guy, but you're playing music, you want to be the thinner guy, because that's kind of the stereotype. And I would see those pictures and I'd be like, man, like I look so thin. But I remember at that time just being like, I'm just a fat piece of shit. Like, so it's like this thing where it's like, I've never, been satisfied. I don't think I've ever been satisfied with my life, in general. And like I said, that's what I'm saying. I don't know if that's like a normal thing or if that's just like, some people, but it's like to your point about talking about, we're always looking for the next step. It's like, that's the way I feel like we're kind of, taught to believe. Yeah. It's like that you're supposed to, and after college, then you got to get the job, and then you need the house and the wife with the white, the white picket fence. You need the kids, and then you got to save up for your retirement. And then I'm thinking like, then you're just going to be old one day, and it's like, I don't know. I just feel like I think maybe a part of it's because our society, it's just so much is just, expected of you as far as like paint by numbers, the way you're supposed to live your life. That, I'm just like, man, like I look back at that time thinking like I should have just really enjoyed that moment of my life. And yeah, like you're saying, I never did, I wasn't like really unhappy, but it was just kind of like, well, what's the next step? Is my band going to get signed? Like, are we going to get famous? What are we going to, it's like, instead of just enjoying that moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just part of growing up. Like I guess I wonder, like if any generation feels differently, but I know speaking, for ourselves, it definitely doesn't seem like, the kind of like I said, the ability to feel at home where we were, or even in our own bodies, just didn't have the tools to do that. And it is really kind of sad to think about, but I didn't necessarily like want to like just go down the sad route, because like you also mentioned Oasis, right? And so, I think like one other thing that I do reflect on is, again, I wasn't a musician, but I did love to write. Like I wrote poetry and stuff in like junior high and high school. And man, I loved to like just get in my feels and get all emo and just crank up some Oasis or, whatever, just something that just really kind of took those emotional knobs and turned them up to 10. Right. And I hear what you're saying. I know that Oasis is a polarizing kind of band, but like when I kind of think back to just all my greatest emo moments of like looking out the window when it was raining or walking along the Chicago, the Lake Michigan shoreline at like 5 a.m. before I was going to catch a flight back home, and it was like snowy, and I was just listening to like I don't know, like Don't Look Back in Anger or Champagne Supernova or something like that. There really is a kind of life-saving aspect to that kind of music when you're in like that emotionally tumultuous time in your life.
Yeah, and I think about like where would I be without music, not really even just like playing music, but just the kind of emotional, like I don't say like support, or whatever it is that music can provide for you, when you are going through a hard time, or, if you need something to cheer you up, like, or whatever emotion you really want to have. It's like, I feel like music is just such an important part of, at least for me, it's such an important part of, of maintaining some kind of like level ground, I guess, in some way.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good way to put it, right? It's like, I don't know, it's almost like a supplement, or, because there are these times where I feel like, I'll be wanting to kind of, express something, or I'll be wanting to feel the fullness of some feeling, whether that's, I know that I'm sad, but I'm working a lot and I'm repressing it. And so I almost have to like sit there and force myself to feel what I know is down there. And the way that I typically do that is I throw on my headphones and I'll play like the same song over and over again until like I'll just start crying on like my stoop. And it's like, it takes that sort of practice, aid from music to kind of bring out what I knew is in there. But the same thing goes for, if you're having a good day and, it just feels like you're on one of those winning streaks, you throw on like a song that's really going to accentuate the hell out of that. And I don't know, I can imagine, in my later years in life, I can still look back on like occasional moments where I was just blasting, like, I don't know, the corniest shit ever, like Hall & Oates or something, but just like feeling like I was on top of the world. Like those definitely are the moments that make life worth living.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, let me ask you this then. So what age was it then when you guys were in the band and went to Nashville? Was that after high school?
Yeah, that would have been pretty much right after high school. So I was probably, 19, 20 years old, like whenever the band was really starting to do pretty well. But, it took us a few years. I think I started playing in the band when I was 17. And then the first couple of years, we were playing anywhere to anybody, like just to play a show really. But then towards the last year and a half of the band, it really started picking up and we started getting record labels that were interested. And so I was probably 19, 20, went out to Nashville and we were supposed to sign a record deal out there. And but at the same time that this great thing in my life was happening, which was like the thing we had dreamed about, which is getting a record deal and like trying to, go on tour and all this other stuff. It's like the band itself was, falling apart because just the personalities were just so, we just did not get along.
Man, how did you guys get together?
We were all, the drummer and the lead singer and guitarist, they were friends from maybe a few years before I even, knew them. And then they needed a bass player. And I was friends with the lead singer, but it's kind of funny because being in a band with them, which I always tell people, it's being in a band with people is like being in a relationship, because you got to spend nights with them. You have to like basically work, practice with them, play shows with them, drive to the shows. I mean, and kind of getting in the band with them is where it, started, coming to a head. But, by the time it really got bad, we were 3-4 years into it. And I was like, man, I put so much time into this that like, I just didn't want to leave it.
Yeah, no, that's gotta be a really hard thing to confront. Like you said, especially at that time in your life. Cause I was gonna kind of ask you, like, again, thinking about that whole complex of, moving through life, always thinking about the next step. Like, so when you graduated, were you just like, this is it? Like, I'm going all in on becoming a professional musician?
Yeah. That was like, because the one thing I miss about being like younger is that like, it's kind of funny, but it's like, I had no idea of reality. It was just anything was possible, and like the idea of this little band from this town outside of Kansas City, like becoming famous, it just seemed like, oh, that's very feasible. And then like you look back on it, you're like, well, actually, it's a, very slim chance of actually becoming reality. And it just, I got out of high school and I knew I didn't want to go to college, but then there was that pressure to go to college, of like, well, what are you going to do with your life? What are you going to, if you're not going to become a banker and like an accountant, like what are you going to do with yourself? But I was like, well, I'm just going to try to do the band for a couple of years and see where it goes. And so once I got out of high school, we really started playing all the time. We started, traveling the United States a little bit, like going to California and doing dumb stuff. Like I remember we drove all the way down to Alabama. So from, Kansas City to Alabama to play one show at a bar. And then we drove back up to Kansas City, which is just like, you look at that, you're like, oh man, that was just, we probably played to 5 middle-aged guys. They're like, what the hell are these, but it's probably not anything I would, I wouldn't change anything about it because it was just, I liked being like ignorant in a way, like of not knowing, like you just didn't look at the world the same way, I guess.
Yeah, it's a real gift to be able to live, however momentarily, not knowing how unattainable your dreams actually are. Because it's nothing to be ashamed about. I mean, you're talking to a guy who was convinced probably much longer than I should have been that a 5'9" stocky Mexican kid who couldn't dunk could still somehow make it to the NBA.
Yeah.
Turns out that was not in the cards, but again, it's like having that dream and like you said, not having kind of anything squash it out for those important years, like gave me a lot of motivation to always go out and shoot around or go, get in pickup games. And that was worth it. It doesn't matter that I didn't become the next Spud Webb. Yeah,
that's funny because that's the player I was thinking of for whatever reason. When you said 5'9", and I know Spud Webb was like even shorter than that, but no, I think that like life can just make you cynical, and and that's kind of within the labor movement. I think like I really respect organizers because. It's such a cynical, like you meet so many cynical workers and it's like you understand why they feel the way they do. But, as an organizer, it's like, people told me, like as an organizer, people aren't telling you no, like all the time, like you're not doing your job, like, or something along those lines. And it's just, once the whole music thing didn't work out for me, and then I kind of drifted around, like just taking like jobs like that I knew wasn't going to be what I wanted to do with my life. I don't know. I think I became cynical over time of like with a lot of aspects of life, I guess. And I drifted until I got into the labor movement, I guess.
All right, I'm going to pull my best Larry King here, and I'm going to say expand on that. So take us through that drift, I guess, because that was going to be my next question. Is like, how did you, I suppose, end up finding your place in the labor movement? How did you end up coming to work at, you said you're at GM, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So talk us through that.
Yeah. So I was just kind of working, like I worked at Walmart before. I worked at like, these other grocery stores. I, worked at a restaurant, and it was like, I was just, like, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I was so disappointed that the music thing didn't work out. But at the same time, it's weird because like when I realized like what the music business was really like, I look back on it and I'm like, I'm kind of glad it didn't work out in a way. Like, not saying I wouldn't want to be a famous musician, but, like I don't even know if I was, cut out for that kind of lifestyle in the long run. But, I just went a few years just being kind of like, I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. And I was just trying to survive. And then at some point, I think it was around 2009 or 2010, one of my best friends who worked at General Motors in Kansas City, he got me a referral to get hired in there. And that's the way that GM at the time, they would only hire people that were referred by UAW members. And that's where you get like a lot of family members or, a lot of people who are just, pro-union people in general would go work there. And they've since changed that. So now that anybody can apply to work there. But yeah, so he got me in there and I thought I won the lottery because you hear the stories about, like General Motors, oh, so you're going to get paid like $50 to do nothing, basically. And I meant to say earlier that I grew up in a very conservative household. So I grew up like hearing about how bad unions were and about how union workers are lazy. And so I was still to some degree buying into that, going into when I first started working at General Motors. And I got hired in as a part-time worker in, I think it was May of 2011.
So was that like, I mean, I'm curious to hear a little more about that, as someone who also grew up very conservative and was just really drenched in all of that, anti-union kind of sentiment. I mean, I heard it just all the time growing up, and it was, it was a lot of it was directed at teachers and kind of public sector workers as kind of being this, example of like a workforce that had become so lazy. And I mean, this was right when, everyone was really pushing for the fucking charter schools and whatnot, right? So they used teachers and teachers unions as the primary punching bag. But at the same time, one of the constant conservative talking points that I heard growing up, whether it was from my family or from Fox News or from right-wing talk radio, was, a lot of the time people would point to the unions and blame them for, the collapse of the auto industry or deindustrialization, right? They would look to Flint and they'd say it was the union's fault. They would say it was like, workers got too greedy. They demanded too much. And the poor, struggling, auto businesses had no other choice but to, leave. And that was very much the narrative that I had heard growing up. So I guess I wanted to kind of ask first, like what it was like for you negotiating that, getting hired at GM. And second, I meant to ask, like, so you said that you got hired so that was around the time when you had this sort of two-tier system. Were you in that kind of bottom tier when you got hired?
Yeah. So I think, the two-tier system started at GM in 2008 or 2009, during the Great Recession. And, so I came in just a little bit after that and I got in there, and you're saying like, how did I negotiate that whole thing? And it's like, I don't know, I guess for me, it's always just been like, one, I always question like what I believe, I guess. Like I'm not afraid to question it, which I think, some people are afraid to question their beliefs really. But that's, fortunately for me, it's one thing I was lucky that I don't have a problem doing that. And I got into the factory and I just, over time, it probably didn't take very long. I just was like, actually it didn't take long at all, because I remember I got in there thinking that I was going to be like putting a screw into a car, like one screw every 5 minutes, and going to be making all this money. And I think I started out under $15 an hour. But, I was coming from Walmart. So, it was still like, a lot better money. And I thought about quitting within the first week. Like it crossed my mind, like this work sucks. Like it's not anything like I was told it was going to be like. And so I thought about quitting, and probably, the seeds of like, me questioning my beliefs on unions and stuff and union workers, like probably was planted like right there, because, it's like, man, this isn't what I was told, like, and so it just opened my eyes. Like, I don't know. I always tell people that becoming a worker at GM just changed my whole viewpoint of like the way I view the labor movement and everything. It just completely changed everything for me. And I'm just very happy that it happened to me, I guess.
Well, so take us back to those early days then. So you mentioned that you expected the job to kind of be like, being on an assembly line, taking a screw, putting it in every 5 minutes, right? So, we always love kind of talking a bit about kind of the day-to-day work that folks do. So first, what shocked you so much about the nature of the work that you weren't expecting? And I guess if you could, for folks who have never been on, a GM shop floor, like what type of work have you been doing since you got hired there?
So I've been working in the trim department at Fairfax since I started working at GM, so about 10 years now. And, the things that really got me was just how fast the line moved and how many tasks you're expected to do on a car. Like I was saying, I expect to be doing like very minimal work. And, you might have to do 10 different tasks, on one car as this car is like clanging along the assembly line. So it's not like it's steady, and you're expected to put these like screws in, but you got to get it in just right. And then you got to, there's like just a myriad of things you could do. Like I installed the seat belts of the rear driver's side before, but that was just like the main component of my job. But then there would be, 6 other things you had to do. And then there was always a thing where, the corporation would always be like, well, we need to add more work to people's jobs so we can cut other people's jobs, so then they would always be coming to you being like, well, we think you can get another element added to your job. And it's just this never ending, battle in a way with management that like, hey, listen, like I can't even, I don't even have the time to get a drink of water in between cars, so it was just the brutal reality of, of the conditions, I guess. And, it was just a jarring experience for me.
It's like a very blown up version of that I Love Lucy episode, right? Where she's on like the chocolate assembly line and she's like stuffing chocolates in her mouth. It's like that, but like, essential tasks with cars to make sure that they're built properly.
Yeah. And it's just this, the auto corporations they're obsessed with, the thing I've never understood about any like company like Amazon or General Motors is the fact that if you make $8 billion net in a year, net profit, like why wouldn't you just be happy with that? But it's like it never ends. Like their desire to get even more profit out of workers, even more profit out of how can we do this cheaper? Oh, now we can get rid of foremen, we can get rid of team leaders, we can get rid of it. Just never ends. Even if that is going to affect quality, like I always say this: the workers care more about quality of the vehicles than management does. Because we know that the product we build, is a reflection of us. And I feel like the corporation cares about short-term profitability. Like let's just pump these vehicles out, make a bunch of money, and then, hey, maybe if 10 years down the road we've lost some customers because we're building an inferior product, then oh well. That's kind of the way I feel like they view business.
Well, and I think this is an important sort of segue into, I really want to get your thoughts on like the moment that we're in now, right? Because I think a lot of folks are kind of getting really excited about, we are in the midst of Striketober. There's a lot of movement happening in organized labor right now, but not just in the organized labor movement, right? We're also living through what many are calling the Great Resignation, where historic levels of workers coming out of the pandemic, even though we're not fully out of the pandemic yet. But a lot of workers are quitting their jobs at historic rates. And they're saying like, you know what, this job sucks. My boss treats me like crap. It doesn't pay enough. It doesn't have enough regularity in scheduling. There are myriad reasons why people are saying, fuck you to this job, right? But the fact that so much of it is happening at once and so many people are kind of participating in what seems like this kind of mass sense that workers have been getting a raw deal for a long time and we're not going to take it anymore, right? There's something really important there. And I think a lot of folks who are reading about this, who are hearing about it, who are learning about it, they're asking like, where did this all come from? Right. And so, then you kind of start hearing the stories from workers like yourself and the other folks we talked to on the show. And you're just like, man, it's been there, right? This has been like a pressure cooker that has built up for not just years, but I mean, decades, right? You know, from you look at all those graphs from like the 1980s onwards, and you see like the wealth of the CEOs and the 1% just skyrocket, and the wages of like everybody else just stagnate with the cost of living. And yet you see like worker productivity go up at the same time. So like workers are now more productive than they've ever been, but they're taking less share of the profits than they ever have, while the bosses and CEOs are like taking all of that extra profit and dumping it into like the pockets of their shareholders, yada, yada, yada. And I mean, like GM is a perfect kind of example of this. If folks want to know, like, where has this pressure come from? Where has how has this dissatisfaction built up for so long? And I guess we'll talk about the kind of union side of that in a minute when we talk about this big referendum. But I guess from the corporate side, I mean, you know, we already started talking about this, right? That you know, you had during the Great Recession and in the years afterwards, right? Everyone knows that the auto industry was not doing great. Government bailed it out. The union took big concessions. Everyone tightened their belts, quote unquote. That was when this sort of two-tier system was really implemented. And I guess I'll ask you to kind of maybe unpack that a bit for listeners in a second. But, you know, anyway, there was all this belt tightening. There's all this talk about shared sacrifice to keep American car manufacturing alive, right? Then what happened? A few years later, GM itself was making like huge profits, and it closed a bunch of plants, and it laid a bunch of people off, including the famous, you know, Lordstown plant in Ohio. I think it was like 14,000 workers alone were laid off in like 2018. And it wasn't because like in 2008, because they were at risk of like, you know, the industry cratering. It was actually so that they could like pay a big ass stockholder, you know, or shareholder like dividend, and, you know, just like totally toss out these thousands of workers whose lives and families depended on these jobs like they were nothing. And then people wonder why workers right now are so pissed. So like, I don't mean to make light of it because it's a very serious situation, but I guess this is all by way of asking you, from your perspective, like, how have you seen that sort of pressure build up in your own, you know, area of work? And also maybe kind of, you know, in the working class writ large, like how do you read that? And I was also wondering if you could kind of expand on like the two-tier thing, because that's something that I think a lot of people don't understand why it's such a sticking point for so many workers, right? But we're hearing about it at you know, the Kellogg's strike. This is something that they were pushing against. It's something that GM workers have talked about. So I guess could you know, take all that mush and talk a bit about where this kind of mass worker dissatisfaction is coming from?
Yeah, so I think it. You know, you kind of stated it pretty well yourself, which is that, you know, this has been decades in the making, and like, for, say, UAW workers in the auto industry, we've been taking concessions for 40 years. You know, now granted, whenever the recession hit, basically the concessions started being, you know, on steroids. Basically, it was like an excuse for the corporations to really gut the union. And, you know, unfortunately, our international leadership is, you know, they buy into this whole idea of like continual improvement, we have to do more and more to be competitive. And, you know, like to your point of saying like, you know, they shut down Lordstown and saying, oh, well, we have to do this, and they're going to keep doing it. You know, actually my plant is one that's on very shaky ground right now, because we're building the Chevy Malibu, which, you know, is a sedan. So it's not selling very well. And then we build the Cadillac XT4, which is never going to be like a high seller. And we've had this chip shortage that's been going on because of COVID and then some other issues. And so we've been laid off since February. And, we see these other plants getting electrical vehicles, big time investments. And, like I always say, like, I'm happy for the workers at those plants that are getting the investments. But at the same time, I'm like, are we going to get an investment? And it's just, you realize when you think about it logically that this whole idea that the corporation, like say General Motors, we're all a team and we have to, shared sacrifice, which I think you brought up. It's like the only people that sacrificed were the workers. That was it. The guy that was the CEO of General Motors at the time that they went bankrupt got a $20 million golden parachute, to get fired basically because he was incompetent. And so the workers took on all these concessions and the two-tier issue, which is basically anyone hired in 2008 and on, there was no more pensions. So no one from 2008 on has a pension, no health care in retirement. The pay we got half the pay for years. So you would have like traditional, they call them traditional workers, legacy workers would be making the full pay. And then I came in at General Motors making $14.97 or, $15 basically. And so basically all of our benefits weren't nearly as good. And that's, but the catch about the two-tier thing is that when they vote for, on these issues like this, the people who are voting aren't the ones who are going to have to take the concession. Like people who are going to keep making their amount of money they made and that would have a pension were voting for the new hires that weren't hired yet to not have a pension. So it's a really devious way that like the company found to really break the union apart in a lot of ways, because you're coming in as a new worker, like working next to people making twice as much money who will have a retirement, that have, health insurance when they retire, and you're working just as hard. And you're like, I will never have those things, and so it's like a psychological battle, I think, as much as like anything else. I think that the biggest benefit the company gets out of two-tier is the psychological warfare, like, because workers buy into what the company wants, which is, they want me, a two-tier worker, to be mad at the legacy worker. And they want the legacy worker to be like, well, just tell those two tiers to shut up because, you got yours, and then they want the two tiers like me to look down on the temps, the temporary workers who really aren't temporary in the auto industry. They work every day. They work just as much as I do. And that's how the system is created. So actually, I'd say we have even more than two tiers, but yeah, it's a really effective strike, or not a strike, a really effective union buster, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I think that, you put that so perfectly, right? It keeps everyone just like looking down at the person below them, or looking kind of like jealously at the worker next to them, but not directing that necessary anger at, the people who had the most say in creating this arrangement, whether they be on the corporate side or even on the union side, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think you're absolutely right? It's the perfect example of divide and conquer. Mm-hmm. And, I think that, I guess even if we stay with GM for a moment, it makes sense why people will be so fucking pissed, because like this two-tier thing, I guess this is a good way of like leading us into discussion of like the union side of things and the importance of this kind of upcoming referendum and the work that caucuses like yours are doing, right? Because, you mentioned that this concessionary stuff has been going on for decades. And I think that's a really important perspective for folks to have. It's certainly something I didn't know a whole lot about until, the past few years. But, I think that folks will maybe have a general sense that, in the late 70s and early 80s, like the auto industry in the United States was also taking hits. countries that had been battered after World War II, like Japan and Germany, were back on their feet. And those cars were, cheaper. And, a lot of people saw that as a threat to the American auto industry. So anyway, I'm giving a very kind of history in 60 seconds here. But I mean, like, in broad strokes, it was that sort of situation that put, a lot of the American automakers like on their heels, to the point where even I think it was like Chrysler was about to go under, got bailed out. And this was like in 1980 or 1981. And so this kind of really catalyzed the process of, okay, to save the American auto industry, we have to constantly be pushing the unions to take more concessions so that these struggling companies can stay alive, right? That was like, and that we can compete on an international level. Like, that was kind of the general sort of talking point. And that was really when the cuts started like coming to like, let all the blood out of, the UAW, and the labor movement itself was really taking hits. We all know that Ronald Reagan kind of declared open season on the labor movement when he broke the PATCO strike. But I digress. The point being is that like, that's really where a lot of this kind of, the UAW and the labor movement in general were not really on the offensive. It was like, here are the kind of consistent cuts and more that you and your members have to give up for us to make this work. And it just kept going that way. And it went that way even more after the recession. And here's where I'm getting to the point where it's like that two-tier system that you were talking about, Justin, was like created as a supposedly like temporary measure to once again keep the struggling auto industry on its feet. It was meant to be, I think, capped at like 25% of the workforce at GM. Please correct me if I'm wrong there. And then, what we've seen since then is that cap has more or less been removed, and like just that lower tier of lower paid, less underprotected workers and the temps as well, like those are the categories that are ballooning, while the kind of, union workers with that full kind of benefits package, like is shrinking in comparison to the rest of the folks there. Do I kind of have those general strokes right?
Yeah. That's pretty much it. You got the nail on the head there, is that, GM, I can always speak about GM, like in pretty great detail. But GM has like certain ways that they go about, it's all about the narrative, and one of the things they do, and unfortunately our international leadership goes along with this, is that, they'll outsource jobs that were once legacy, traditional working jobs in the UAW. They'll outsource these jobs to like a third party, basically. Like, I think it's called GM Subsystems LLC. And these are workers that are paid half the wages, blah, blah, blah. But like, they don't get reported as like being line workers, like how I am, or how like a legacy worker would be. And so it's a way for the, General Motors to kind of, just kind of shift the narrative and be like, well, look, we're like, everybody's like, they're saying now that they got rid of the two-tier system. I mean, that was their big claim after the 2019 strike, and we came to that contract agreement. Was like, well, look, the tiers are gone now. And it's like, well, one, in my opinion, until every, worker had a pension and healthcare and retirement, okay, if we're both making the same hourly wage, are we equal? Like, I don't think we are. But then it's like, like I say, they're like, we got rid of the two tiers. It's like, yeah, because there's like 4 or 5 tiers now. But for some reason, it's like looked past, and I don't think that our international leadership, they're not going to acknowledge it, because they've been complicit in allowing the company to do these kinds of things. Like, actually in Spring Hill, Tennessee, the General Motors plant in Spring Hill, the leadership agreed to a memorandum of understanding where they would outsource more of these jobs to stay competitive, And so those are jobs that were good paying jobs that will now be done by people making, a lot less wages with a lot less benefits. And this is, it's just like you were saying, it never ends. And our leadership is just perfectly fine continuing down this road of like, but my thing is, where does it end? Like, when would it stop? Because their whole thing is like you said, is, well, we've got to remain competitive with, the global economy. And it's like, well, is there any way for a U.S. auto worker to be competitive with someone working in Argentina? Like, I talked to a General Motors worker that lives in Mexico. He works in Mexico, and he told me that he makes $65. And I said, "Oh, $65 a day?" He's like, "No, a week." So they make $65 a week. How can we compete with that?
Wow.
So it's like, but that's how insane, our international leadership and, I know what General Motors is doing, like, they're never going to be happy, but like, our international leadership is trying to sell us on this idea of, we've got to keep, guys, it's what we got to do, to remain competitive. And there's like this, I looked this up because it's unbelievable to me, but in 1970, there were 400,000 GM UAW workers. And today there are less than 50,000. So the amount of money that General Motors has saved by automation, by closing plants, by, because to your point, saying like, we're more productive today than we've ever been, and they're still crying broke. And our union is still happy to say, yep, we got to keep giving up more to appease the company.
Man, and yeah, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head, right? Where it's just like, it'll never be enough for them. That's maybe that's the lesson we've finally started to learn. And when I say me, I mean like, workers in general, that, we've gone so long taking so many concessions, or, and I'm speaking, I guess, more generally here, because you could talk about the fact that like the federal minimum wage has now gone the longest amount of time in U.S. history without being lifted, even though the cost of living has gone up. And right now everyone's freaking out about inflation. Like, that's a fucking concession, right? That's that's money that you are owed, for the labor that you do. That is a direct undervaluing of the work that you do, while everyone's looking around, especially after the pandemic. And you're like, Jesus, the super rich increased their wealth by an astronomical amount. Like, I mean, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, listeners, right? Go look at the numbers of like how much the super rich have expanded their wealth over the course of this pandemic, and then think about, again, all those concessions that working people have taken for so long, because we were told that you just can't raise the federal minimum wage. You just can't kind of pay workers more in general, because then, mom and pop businesses couldn't afford it, or we can't have more childcare, subsidies for childcare, or public healthcare like Medicare for all, which would like take a huge bargaining chip out of the boss's hand if workers didn't have to worry about their healthcare going away. If that was just a right that everyone had, then we could focus on kind of other shit. But, we don't. And that in a lot of ways is a concession. It's putting us on our heels. It's giving kind of all that bargaining power to the bosses and to the politicians that serve them, yada, yada, yada. Now you got me on a roll here, man. So I'm like, so like before we zoom out too much, I really want to pick up on what you were saying about how, in a lot of ways, the UAW leadership, the international leadership, has let this happen and has, been part of this. I mean, and this is really, like why the referendum for which ballots, I think, are going out tomorrow, right? And workers will have to have those ballots back by next month. Like, this is why this is so significant. But I mean, even just like in recent years, people have been like seeing, I think they've been seeing the kind of headlines about, former UAW presidents like Dennis Williams and Gary Jones getting like, charges from the feds on corruption, and just hearing those same old stories that we hear about, the Teamsters or now the UAW, right? About this kind of top-down union corruption, right? And so people may have a little sense that there is like problem, that there are problems like within the union. but I don't think that your average person knows how much deeper it goes than that, and kind of how, like you said, that sort of concessionary philosophy where it feels like union leadership is more hand in glove with management than serving the rank and file. Like that, there's a lot there that people don't necessarily understand when they're told to just focus on the sort of high profile corruption cases. So I was wondering if you could kind of like lay out for listeners, I mean, honestly, I'll ask it bluntly, like, why is this referendum so important? And what is it? And how did we get to this point?
Yeah, so the referendum vote's happening because of the corruption scandal that you talked about, where I want to say, I don't know, I think it's 11 UAW officials were found guilty of embezzling, of conspiring with Fiat Chrysler, which is now Stellantis, basically to suppress, to basically get a favorable contract for Fiat Chrysler. And, the government investigated, and then the government mandated that this referendum would take place because in the UAW, we've had a single political party within our union that has controlled every aspect of the UAW for over 70 years. Since 1946, Walter Reuther became the president of the UAW. And then I think it was 1947, they controlled every seat on the, executive board. And it just has, they eventually got control of everything, and I don't want to put Walter Reuther, in the same sentence as, Dennis Williams or Gary Jones, because it's not like that, but it was a lack of democracy over time that really has ruined our union, because no matter how bad things get in our union, the same people get elected, reelected, the same people with the same ideology. And that's that political party is called the Administration Caucus. And the Administration Caucus was formed by Walter Reuther back in the 40s. And they consolidated their power. And they've only strengthened their grip over the years. And so, our current system that we have is a delegate system, basically. So at my local, we voted for people, ran for delegate. We voted for them, people from my local, and then they went up to the convention in 2018 and they voted for, so it's basically delegates go up and they elect who our international executive board officers are going to be. And somehow these delegates through the years, through 70 plus years, have always voted for the same party over and over and over. And the reason why that is because the only way you can advance your career within the UAW is if you are loyal to that party. And if you are not loyal to the party, that you have no future. As far as like trying to get up to international, the Administration Caucus is very vindictive. You can look through history of like in the 80s, Assistant Region Director for Region 5, Jerry Tucker, ran for Regional Director. And he wasn't supposed to do that because the caucus didn't want him to do that because the Regional Director was running for re-election. And so that broke the caucus's rules, and they basically cheated in the election, the delegate election. They had people vote in that delegate election that weren't even delegates. And this got investigated by the Department of Labor. I think this was 1986. And the Department of Labor found that there was cheating, and they called for another election. And then Jerry Tucker won he won on that rerun. And when he got into office for Region 5, the rest of the International Executive Board basically, iced him out, basically, like, we're not going to let you do anything you want to do. And the UAW president, Owen Bieber, at the time, he told the Region 5 staffers, like, hey, you work for me, you don't work for Jerry Tucker. And so, like, in these few, occasions where someone from the outside was able to legitimately use the system we have to win, the Administration Caucus found a way to make it to wherever they wouldn't get reelected or they couldn't be effective. They couldn't implement their vision for what they wanted for Region 5 or, for whatever region. And another example would be 2002. I think it was 2002. The regional director for Region 1. His name was Warren Davis. He was supposed to resign because the Administration Caucus has a rule where once you're 65 years or older, you have to retire. Well, Warren Davis wanted to run for re-election even though he was 65. And so he ran and he won re-election, and the delegates voted to dissolve Region 1 so that he couldn't be regional director. They dissolved the whole region just to stop someone that they didn't want from being on the International Executive Board, from being on the IEB. And so there's like no links that they won't go. And so basically we have just like, we have a dictatorship is what it is. And so the referendum vote is, do we want to keep this delegate system, or do we want to move to a one member, one vote system where every UAW member would get their own vote to vote for who they want to be on the International Executive Board?
Man, and so I mean, I thank you for kind of breaking that down. I have so many thoughts, but I also don't want to kind of keep you too long. And I guess like maybe by way of following up, I wanted to sort of like connect that back to what we were talking about before. Like, I guess could you say a bit more about like if this referendum passes, like what it would mean from your day-to-day reality on the shop floor to kind of the larger body of the union itself?
Yeah, so I think like if it passes, and I feel good about it, because I feel like that most members are really tired of the international leadership. Because, for example, let's look at John Deere. John Deere, the corporation, is making record profits right now. Yet our international leadership negotiated a deal, a tentative agreement, where new hires, people hired after this contract gets ratified, if it does, when it does, they wouldn't have a pension at all. So they're negotiating away a benefit to the worker during times of record profit for John Deere. And this has been going on. Like, GM is very profitable, yet they closed 4 plants. I believe it was 4 plants in 2019. Lordstown, there's one in California, one in Maryland. It's like, why are we giving anything up during times of record profit? But that's all the international leadership knows is give up more. I got to give up more. The company says we got to give up a little bit more this time, guys. And so if we could win one member, one vote, that in and of itself would be a historic victory for workers in our union, because to me it would decentralize the Administration Caucus's power within our union. So now it's not happening all at a convention, but it's spread out through our whole union, where these elections are happening through mail-in ballot, and they can't control the process nearly as much. I'm sure that they're going to try to, by intimidation or, so when they have these conventions and delegates are, going to vote for who our International Executive Board officers are going to be, the Administration Caucus has various ways that they can influence those delegates' decisions. They can offer them an appointed job at International, making $100,000+ with a pension. Or they can try to intimidate delegates and say, hey, listen, if you don't vote for Gary Jones, your plant, you might not get a future product from General Motors. I mean, this is stuff that they will do and will say to get what the result they want from delegates. So to me, like, taking that decision-making out of the delegates' hands and into the membership's hands would empower the membership, and it would just decentralize the power of the Administration Caucus to a great degree.
And I mean, just to really put a fine point on what you were saying for listeners, right? And again, I think it's exciting that more people are waking up to this, right? Because I've been like screaming about this on shows that have asked me to come on and talk about kind of the strike wave and the Great Resignation and yada yada yada. And like, one of the points that I keep trying to make sure I put in there is I'm like, look, like we've been subjected for months, if not the better part of a year now, from like these pieces of shit from like the Chamber of Commerce, from, you know, these business class serving think tanks and so on and so forth. And politicians who are bought off, like all beyond mainstream media, and just constantly saying, no one wants to work. No one wants to work. You know, all these jobs are available and people are too lazy. Workers have gotten, you know, fat off of like government assistance. They've gotten lazy and they don't want to go back. And these poor businesses are suffering, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, motherfucker, like John Deere is set to make like $5.7 billion this year. like they are not hurting. They're doing fine. And like, you know, if you look around at like these other kind of places where strikes are happening, this needs to be part of the narrative, right? Like, because in fact, you know, because I think, you know, again, people tend to think about, all right, we went through a recession. Obviously, a lot of people are hurt. And yes, that's very true. Like we were talking about this when the Amazon union drive in Bessemer was going on. It's like, so many small businesses and even mid-sized businesses were totally wiped off the map with the the pandemic, and Amazon has gobbled up like a lot of that sector of the economy into itself. Meanwhile, a lot of these other, especially kind of consumer product-based businesses have actually seen like explosions in demand, and it kind of makes sense, right? I remember talking to Sherry Renfro. She was a worker at Frito-Lay who was on strike back in July. And she said, she's like, look, during a pandemic, everyone's staying home. People eat a lot more chips. And so our demand has skyrocketed. And so, but because the working conditions are so bad, you know, we can't retain workers. And so the long timers like myself are basically doing a shit ton of forced overtime and we never get to see our families, yada, yada, yada. Then you hear about like the same shit happening at Kellogg's. People were eating a lot more cereal at home because people didn't feel safe going to restaurants for more of their meals, right? Makes a lot of sense. So thus, workers are working a shit ton of more overtime. And that's not even what they're striking about. They're striking over the two-tier system at Kellogg's. Same thing going on at somewhere like Heaven Hill Distillery, the whiskey distillery that makes some of the most popular bourbons around the world, and has seen that kind of, you know, demand go up because, again, COVID-19 is happening. People are drinking a lot more, you know, like, you know, it kind of makes sense. And so to try to fill that demand, you know, you get like the same sort of like crazy work schedules, and the union's really pushing back against Heaven Hill wanting like these like extended weekend schedules that you can never really plan on or plan around. Yada, yada, yada. Anyway, hopefully listeners, you're seeing this trend here, right? Like it's not just like, you know, a bunch of mom and pop businesses that are struggling to find someone to fill this job. It's like, no, like there are a lot of companies and a lot of individual billionaires and so on and so forth who have done very fucking well for themselves over the past 2 years. And they're trying to do what they always have done, which is squeeze as much out of workers as they possibly can while paying them as little as they possibly can. The greed, as Justin was saying a lot earlier, is like they can't help themselves. It'll never be enough because I think for so long, we've been pushed on our heels and we've taken that crap. And so the bosses have really just gotten used to workers being this kind of compliant, you know, like a subservient like workforce that'll take whatever crap it's given. And now that's not happening, I think everyone's losing their shit, which is great to see. But I guess I wanted to kind of ask you that by way of kind of rounding out, is like building on all the kind of energy that is behind this referendum in the UAW and seeing everything that we're seeing around us, from John Deere to Kellogg's to McDonald's workers going on strike. I guess, like, what do you make of this moment, man?
No, I think it's a lot of what you're saying about, I just think people they're tired of giving up stuff and just being told to be happy they have a job, you know? And I just think that 40 years of people being stepped on it's finally taken enough of a toll on people that they're willing to fight, you know? And because, I think people should realize that it's never going to be enough, you know? I mean, like I said, General Motors is an extremely profitable company and they're constantly looking for ways to wring out even more profits from each worker, and that's never going to stop. And unions are supposed to be there to fight against that, and we need fighting unions. We need militant unions, and that's something that, I don't think we have a lot of in this country. The UAW is definitely not one. Like, what is our international leadership doing to support John Deere workers? Like, they're not trying to shine a light on this through social media, through their contacts with the media. I'm sure they could get on television. I mean, Dennis Williams got on television to endorse Hillary Clinton back in 2016. He went on Meet the Press for that. But they're not going to get on TV and be like, hey, this John Deere strike's going on, and this is why these workers are striking. It's like, it's just business as usual, which is, I think our international leadership likes to keep us all divided. You're at this local, you should only care about what goes on at this local. You're at this local, don't worry about what goes on. Hey, you're an auto worker, don't worry about what goes on at John Deere. It's like, but that's obviously a huge mistake. It's obviously wrong. And, within the UAW, I think if these John Deere workers can win their strike, I mean, I just think it would really boost the morale of, members in our union, that yes, it is possible to win. Like, it is possible to be militant and stand up for what is right and to win, which, in the UAW, I mean, it hasn't happened in a long time. I want to say, from what I know and what I can remember from, reading a bunch of stuff, is that it would have been in the 90s whenever I think it was GM workers went on strike up there in Michigan, and it was like a wildcat strike basically. So the International didn't want them going on strike. It was at Buick City is what they called it, and they won, more jobs. They won all their demands. Because they were smart about it, and they knew, like, if we strike, the local president up there, he actually calculated how much money GM was going to lose each day that those workers were on strike. And it really hurt General Motors, and General Motors gave in, but I just hope that John Deere workers, like, and I'm sure they realize this, but from being out on strike in 2019, your international leadership, our current international leadership, I should say, they're not, I mean, I think that they'd be happy just to starve out the John Deere workers. I feel like that's what happened to us at General Motors. They starved us out for 6 weeks. I should say they helped the company starve us out for 6 weeks. And then they knew after 6 weeks, a lot of people were hurting for money. Here's this contract that we could have got a lot better contract, but here's this one where if you agree to it, then we agree to let them close Lordstown and, the 3 or 4 other plants, and it's going to be, I don't know how long, I can't say how long John Deere workers will be on strike, but, the caucus I'm a part of, UAWD, we're currently doing a fundraiser, and in one day we've been able to raise $32,000. And this money we're going to send directly to these locals that are on strike, because I just think what's going on there at John Deere and what's going on at Kellogg's and all these other places where people are striking, it's just so important that working people start really fighting back and that we really start winning again. And it's not going to happen if we just keep following the leadership of, people that have more in common with the CEOs than they do of the person working on the shop floor.